Welcome to your favorite channel, where we uncover the untold stories behind fame, love, and betrayal. Tonight's story is about passion, deception, and heartbreak. Matt Roloff and Caryn Chandler thought they could overshadow Chris Marek, treating him as just Amy's quiet husband, a bystander in the Roloff family drama. They were wrong. While Matt focused on building his dream home and Caryn planned her Arizona retirement, Chris Marek was quietly preparing something much bigger, a careful, patient plan for revenge. And now the truth is coming out. For years, viewers have wondered when someone would finally outplay the Roloff power couple. That moment has arrived. According to leaked insider reports, Chris didn't just collect evidence. He set a trap, one Caryn Chandler allegedly walked right into, which could bring serious legal consequences, not just public backlash. This is the story of how Chris Marek went from background character to lead investigator in the biggest scandal to hit little people big world. Chris is often shown as a mild-mannered realtor who just wants everyone to get along. But his real profession is important. He is a real estate professional who deals with contracts, property law, and financial audits. He knows what legitimate business records look like and what money laundering looks like. The story begins on a rainy Tuesday in Hillsborough. Amy was stressed about a routine tax audit, sorting old documents from the years before she sold her portion of the farm. Chris offered to help. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon of filing receipts. But as he flipped through payments from the peak pumpkin season 3 years earlier, he noticed something unusual, a recurring payment to a company called CMC Logistics. On the surface, it seemed normal. Farms pay for seeds, equipment, labor, and consulting. But Chris noticed the payment was $15,000 a month, and he had never seen or heard of CMC Logistics at the farm. There were no consultants or logistics teams on site. The payments coincided with months when Matt claimed the farm couldn't afford a fair buyout for Amy. Chris didn't alarm Amy. Instead, he decided to quietly investigate. That night, he searched the Oregon Secretary of State Business Registry for CMC Logistics. Nothing. Then he checked Arizona, where Caryn had long ties. He found CMC Logistics registered there, but it wasn't a logistics company. It was a sole proprietorship for lifestyle consulting, with a generic Phoenix lawyer as its agent. Digging further, he found the mailing address was less than 2 miles from Matt and Caryn's Arizona vacation home. Chris knew coincidences weren't proof. He needed to see where the money was going. He didn't have access to the farm computers, but 2 weeks later, an opportunity arose. Matt asked Chris to help move some equipment from the big barn. Chris agreed. After moving the gear, Matt suggested grabbing water in the office. While Matt was distracted by a phone call from Caryn, Chris noticed the computer was unlocked. QuickBooks was open. Chris filtered the vendor list for CMC Logistics. The approval stamps weren't for Matt. They were initialed CC. Caryn Chandler was approving invoices for her own shell company. This was embezzlement. Then Chris saw a note on a $25,000 transfer, Asset Depreciation Adjustment Fund transfer. He realized the money wasn't just being stolen, it was meant to make the farm look less profitable, devaluing the business. This would lower buyout prices for Amy or the kids, funding Matt and Caryn's retirement. When Matt turned back, Chris remained calm. He had the proof but couldn't take the computer. He asked to print a gas receipt for helping with the equipment. Matt, distracted, agreed. Chris had his hard evidence. Chris didn't print a gas receipt. He pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, something he had kept for weeks, hoping for this moment. In a flurry of keystrokes, he exported the last 5 years of transaction history and emails tied to the vendor accounts. The progress bar crawled across the screen as Matt talked about the new house foundation, completely unaware that Chris was quietly gathering damning evidence. When the download finished, Chris removed the drive, slipped it into his pocket, and stood up. "Thanks, Matt. Printer's out of paper, but don't worry about the gas."
"It's on me," he said.
Chris left the farm with the evidence burning a hole in his pocket. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove to a coffee shop in the next town, found a corner booth where he wouldn't be noticed, and plugged the drive into his laptop. That's when the story shifted from financial fraud to personal betrayal. The emails showed the depth of Caryn's manipulation. Exchanges with her Arizona-registered agent explained how to structure payments so they wouldn't trigger IRS flags. The most damning evidence was a draft email Caryn wrote to Matt but never sent. It outlined a plan called Operation Clean Slate, showing how to make the pumpkin season look chaotic and expensive to justify huge consulting costs. She mocked Amy's lack of business knowledge, saying she'll never look at the P&L statements. She just looks at the bank balance. As long as the checks don't bounce, she won't know we're bleeding the beast dry. Chris stared at the words bleeding the beast dry. This was the woman who smiled at family gatherings and claimed she wanted peace. Chris knew he couldn't just hand this to Amy. It would break her heart. Legally, they had to be smart. If they went to the police now with stolen data, it could be inadmissible. He needed Caryn to incriminate herself. He needed her to make a mistake. Chris went home and acted normal. He kissed Amy, asked about her day, and cooked dinner. But in his mind, a plan was forming. He would make Caryn panic, forcing her to slip up. Chris was about to start a psychological game. The next week, Chris suggested a double date. He told Amy he wanted to smooth things over with Matt and Caryn before the next pumpkin season. Amy hesitated, but Chris insisted. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, he thought, though he told Amy it was for the sake of the grandkids. They invited Matt and Caryn over for a barbecue. The evening started calmly. Wine was poured, there was small talk about the weather and the new build. Chris played the gracious host, laughing at Matt's jokes and complimenting Caryn's outfit. Then he dropped the first hint of his trap. You know, he said casually while slicing steak, Amy and I have been looking at our estate planning. We're thinking of hiring a forensic accountant to do a deep dive on everything, purely for tax purposes, so we never have to think about it again. The silence was deafening. Chris kept his eyes on Caryn, watching the color drain from her face. She set her wine glass down too hard. A forensic accountant? She asked, voice tight. Is that really necessary? It sounds expensive. Oh, it's worth it for peace of mind, Chris replied, smiling warmly. These guys are amazing. They can find a missing penny from 10 years ago. They trace everything, shell companies, hidden assets, duplicate invoices. Fascinating technology. Caryn choked on her water. Matt tried to intervene, claiming their books were messy but honest. Caryn, however, was already distracted, tapping furiously on her phone. Chris knew she was likely messaging her lawyer or accessing the bank accounts to move money. The trap was set. The dinner ended abruptly. Caryn claimed a sudden migraine and left. As they drove away, Amy said, "That was weird, right?" Caryn seemed so on edge. Chris just squeezed her hand. Maybe she didn't like the steak, he said, but he knew the truth. Caryn wasn't going home to sleep. She was heading to the farm office. What Caryn didn't know was that Chris had anticipated this. During the equipment move, when he was left alone in the office, he had installed a tiny motion-activated trail camera on a top shelf, disguised between binders. It pointed directly at the shredder and file cabinets. At 11:45 p.m., Chris received a notification on his phone. He opened the live feed. There was Caryn Chandler in a tracksuit, frantically pulling binders from 2018 and 2019 and feeding pages into the shredder. He watched silently as she tried to destroy the physical evidence he had already saved digitally. Then she did something that sealed her fate. She opened the safe. Chris didn't know the combination, assuming only Matt had it, but Caryn punched it in without hesitation. She pulled out cash and a black ledger book he hadn't seen before and stuffed them into a tote bag. This was no longer just accounting errors. This was grand larceny and obstruction of justice. She was destroying evidence after being tipped off about a potential audit. Chris hit record on the app, saving the footage to his cloud. He now had the digital trail, emails, and video proof of the cover-up. He spent the next 48 hours compiling the Merrick dossier, printing emails, highlighting bank transfers, burning video onto a secure drive, and organizing everything into a clear timeline of greed and deception. He wasn't going to take this to Matt, either complicit or too incompetent. Chris went straight to the district attorney. The morning he walked into the police station was the turning point. Calm and collected, he requested the fraud division. He laid the binder on the desk. "I'm not here to file a complaint," he said. "I'm here to report a crime in progress." Authorities took the evidence seriously. The amounts involved were felonies, and because the money moved across state lines from Oregon to Arizona, federal agencies could get involved. Wire fraud was on the table, and Chris had built an airtight case. After leaving the police station, Chris didn't go home immediately. He drove in silence, letting the weight of what he had done sink in. For years, he had been in the background, the quiet husband who never made waves. Now, he was at the center of a storm, holding evidence that could topple a couple of people who had underestimated him for far too long. He stopped at a small park on the outskirts of town. The winter air was cold, sharp, but it cleared his mind. He replayed everything in his head: the invoices, the shell company, Caryn approving payments to herself, the emails mocking Amy, the video of Caryn destroying evidence. Every detail fit together like pieces of a puzzle. It was more than fraud, it was betrayal. It was someone systematically trying to strip a family of its legacy. Chris knew he had to move carefully. Going public too soon could alert Matt and Caryn, giving them a chance to destroy more evidence. But at the same time, he couldn't wait forever. The authorities would need a full, organized case. That meant cross-checking every transaction, confirming bank trails, and compiling the timeline. He had already done the heavy lifting with the digital files, but he still needed confirmation from other sources. Over the next week, Chris worked almost nonstop. Amy noticed he was distracted but didn't pry. He pulled together accountants, financial advisors, and legal contacts he trusted. Every night, after Amy went to bed, he would sit with his laptop,